First this morning, the deepening political problems in the Conservative Party following the shock departure of Boris Johnson and two other MPs. So with the Prime Minister's focus set to be on sorting out his own party, will getting Stormont back up and running now be pushed down Rishi Sunak's to-do list? I'm joined from Stormont by the newly elected Deputy Leader of the DUP, Gavin Robinson. Congratulations. We'll talk about your new position in a moment. But first, was Boris Johnson right to go before he was pushed?
Well, he's made his own decision in that regard, and I think it's interesting that around 3 or 4 weeks ago there was a suggestion that this might happen. There was a suggestion that Nigel Adams would be the first to go. I think he was the third to go in the end, and to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if there was further such examples later this week. But it is a matter for them and the Conservative Party. Our job has to be to ensure that in resolving the issues that have dogged the return to devolution in Northern Ireland, that we maintain the Prime Minister's focus and that we get the job done.
But the DUP had a very close relationship with Boris Johnson going back a number of years. And when you look at what has happened over the last few days, how he's criticised the Privileges Committee, do you regret trusting him, being so close to him?
No, we build relationships for the benefits of Northern Ireland in Westminster. Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister, and before that we had built relationships with him. But our job is to represent the people of Northern Ireland in Westminster. You do that through building relationships, and we will continue to do that because we know the issues that have dogged return to devolution in Northern Ireland. We know as well the progress that has been made on the basis of the work we have done thus far. So our focus is on finishing that job, not getting detracted or delayed by psychodrama in Westminster, but making sure that the focus is there on the important benefits that would be associated with getting the job done and getting this place working successfully.
But given that he was the one that brought in the protocol deal that forced you out of Stormont, do you regret? Because that was no benefit to the DUP at all. Will you be a bit more careful about who you trust in the future?
I'm not sure how many times we need to repeat the message, but we operate on the basis of loving many and trusting few and always paddling our own canoe. We stand up for people in Northern Ireland. We want to see Northern Ireland succeed. We do that by building relationships across the political spectrum in Westminster, and that's the job we will continue to do. We have been engaged with government, we've engaged with previous governments, and we will continue to engage until we get an answer to the friction of trade issues, the democratic deficit issues, and the constitutional harm issues that have plagued and bedevilled the return to devolution in Northern Ireland. It's important work, Tara, and we're not going to be distracted by personalities in this. We need to get on and do the job.
But will you be distracted, will Rishi Sunak be distracted by what's going on in his party? So is that not going to make your job much more difficult to get Northern Ireland on the top of his agenda at the minute? He's got bigger fish to fry.
Well, that brings me back to where we started. We won't be derailed from our focus and our job. The job before us now is to make sure that that determination that we show in Westminster is responded to positively, is reciprocated, that we all recognise the benefits that devolution brings to Northern Ireland, and that a return on a stable and a sustainable basis would have for the people of Northern Ireland. So we have clearly, consistently and continually outlined the problems. We've recognised the progress, and we know that we have a job still to do. That's what we'll do, and we'll ensure that we maintain their focus as we chart this course.
There will be people watching who may well say, look, that building behind you, look at what's happening in the health service, look at the cost of living crisis. It has affected everybody, and all we hear from the DUP is what you've just said time and time again. You're working hard to get back in. When will it happen? Ian Paisley says it'll be an ice age. Jeffrey Donaldson kind of suggested there was some movement this week. Where do you stand on that? And as Deputy Leader, what will you be saying to your party?
Well, the answer is it will happen when the job is done. We're not looking for short-term sticking plasters. We're not looking for an obvious and immediate return without resolving the issues that have plagued devolution in the past, and if so, would be set to continue to plague devolution in the future. I have been highlighting for months and months about the difficulties in the funding arrangements for Northern Ireland, about how unsustainable that is. I've heard people in a very casual and cavalier way suggest that if we had an additional £1 billion, all would be well, and that is so far from the the truth, that if you want to see devolution returned on a positive and a sustainable basis, then the funding arrangements for Northern Ireland are going to have to be resolved as well. And that is a hugely important consideration when you advance into your next topic on health reform. But whether it's health, education, Sure Start, additional facilities throughout Northern Ireland, and infrastructure, all of it needs to be on the table, because a return to devolution without resolving the issues that have plagued it thus far, and without the financial firepower to make sure that we are delivering positively for the people in Northern Ireland, will not work. So it's about getting it right, not interested in sticking plasters or fig leaves. It's about resolving the issues that have bedeviled devolution thus far, and making sure that there is something positive and progressive and worthwhile advancing for the people of Northern Ireland.
Gavin Robinson, your party has been accused of a political stunt over the opposition to John Finucane attending the IRA commemoration later this afternoon. What about the relationships with Sinn Féin? Are people not entitled to remember their dead in a way that they see fit?
Well, I'm sorry that you've asked the question in that way. This isn't about us or stunts. This is about representing not only the views of victims throughout Northern Ireland who are hurt today, but highlighting the fact that John Finucane has about 6 hours left to decide whether he wants to proceed with being a hypocrite on these issues or withdraw, because he recognises the impact and the harm this is having on victims. You cannot burnish your credentials as a victim one day and then tarnish the memory of victims and their loved ones the next. This should not be happening when we consider about the need to bring communities together. This should not be happening when we consider the need to reconcile our communities, that anybody, let alone a member of Parliament and a victim, would go to a family fun day to show respect for terrorists, shows just how shallow some of the commitments about an Ireland for all are that have been shared with us over the previous number of weeks. I think it's a huge shame, and I do think there's still time for John and for Sinn Féin to step back from this. But I suspect I, alongside many throughout this community, will be bitterly disappointed today.
Gavin Robinson, thanks very much indeed for your time. The government has published a series of new amendments to its controversial legacy bill ahead of the final stages of its likely passage at Westminster in the coming weeks. All parties here, the Irish government and victims' groups, are united in their opposition to the bill and say the amendments don't go far enough. Lord Kane, who's led on the legislation for the government, acknowledged it's been very challenging.
And so my pledge back in November last year was to take my time, not to rush the bill, and to try and come forward working with victims groups, with political parties, with parliamentarians and others to make improvements to the legislation. I hope they've taken on board a number of criticisms and concerns, and that people, will look at this, give it a fair wind, and recognise that we have made a genuine and honest attempt to improve the legislation.
Well, Alison is still here. Did the amendments go far enough?
I think in some ways they actually made it worse. Now we're having changes to the inquest that weren't in the original legislation, which said that any inquests that were at a substantive point would go ahead. Now we're saying there's going to be a cut-off date next year, and those inquests will automatically, whether they're in train or not, will automatically go into the new legacy investigations. And that for families, some of them who have been waiting 40, 50 years on an inquest, it's going to be devastating, because they campaigned, they lobbied to get those inquests. The legislation itself, I think, it is incredibly unfair. It was done without any real consultation with victims. And if you remember, Brandon Lewis stood up and announced it right at the week that the whole world was getting into lockdown, and I think that was very unfair on victims. But I also do think that we're now at the stage where people need to be honest with those people who are waiting. This legislation is not going to be stopped. It is going to go ahead. I don't think that Declan Morgan would have taken on that role had he not thought this legislation was robust enough to stand up to legal challenge. And therefore, I think it's time to be honest with victims. I mean, I've heard people saying, Irish America is going to sort of wade in on a white horse and save us all from this legislation. The American government themselves have, wars that are much more recent than ours, that they're covering up the actions of their soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. They're certainly not going to come and save save us from this legislation. So maybe now is the time to start looking at what can be done to make it fair and to make it deliver for people, because the process we have now doesn't work. We know that. You know, it's some people might get, the odd person might get a conviction, some people might get an inquest, some people get nothing at all, and the majority of people, I think, are just left really frustrated. So I think maybe now is the time for, you know, some tough love and honest conversations about where this is going to go in the future and what can be achieved from it.
What have you made about the controversy surrounding John Finucane's attendance at this IRA commemoration today?
I think the conversations about commemorations are just something we don't have in any kind of sensible way. These things arise and there's a big public, you know, scandal, there'll be a lot of media attention, and then we'll move on until the next one. And I do think that as part of our legacy proposals, there needs to be a real honest conversation about commemorations. I mean, my own personal opinion is that commemorations should take place once a year, whether it be Remembrance Day or Easter. And in the meantime, those smaller commemorations that cause so much hurt, it's maybe time to look at saying, is this actually achieving anything? Can we just have one central commemoration? Each person, whether it be the army, whether that be Republicans or Loyalists, has their commemoration once a year, because you can see that this has caused so much hurt.
The history of how we remember. Alison, thanks very much indeed, and to my panel. That's all we've got time for this morning. Thanks to all of my guests.